All right, everyone, get ready, because we are about to take a deep dive that will really make you think. Today, we're going to explore the world of causation, but we're not just talking about any old cause and effect.
Yeah.
We're diving specifically into manipulability theories of causation.
Exactly. And to guide us through this exploration, we're going to be looking closely at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on causation and manipulability. It's a pretty dense article, but trust me, it is full of interesting stuff that is really worth unpacking.
Oh yeah, for sure. Now, some of you listening might be thinking, causation doesn't seem that complicated. But get ready to have those assumptions challenged, because the basic idea behind these manipulability theories is this. If you can manipulate something, let's just call it C, and that reliably leads to a change in something else, we'll call that E, then C is probably a cause of E.
Right.
So you can think of it kind of like a light switch, right?
Right.
You flick the switch, that's our C, and then the light turns on, that's our E. Simple enough, eh?
Yeah, it does seem pretty straightforward, at least on the surface.
Right.
But as you dig deeper, things definitely get a lot more complex. But one of the things that makes this theory so appealing, especially in scientific circles, is how it connects to the idea of experimentation.
Yeah?
Scientists, they're all about controlling variables, making changes, and then observing the results.
Exactly. And that emphasis on actually getting in there and manipulating things, it's actually reflected in one of the kind of foundational quotes about this whole topic.
Yeah.
This is from Cook and Campbell's experimental design text. And they write, "The paradigmatic assertion in causal relationships is that manipulation of a cause will result in the manipulation of an effect." So it's really about that hands-on approach to figuring out what causes what.
Yeah, it's all about that tinkering.
Exactly. But here's where those early versions of the theory started running into a bit of a problem. They leaned really heavily on the idea of human agency, right? Like it had to be us humans doing the manipulating.
Right.
It wasn't just enough for a change to happen naturally. Someone had to be there pulling the strings, so to speak.
Yeah.
But I can definitely see how that would cause problems. After all, there are lots of things in the universe that we humans can't just manipulate whenever we want.
Exactly. And the Stanford Encyclopedia article has a really good example that helps illustrate this point. It talks about a barometer and a storm, right? So we all know that atmospheric pressure, it affects both the reading on a barometer and it also affects the formation of a storm.
Right.
But what if someone messed with the barometer needle directly, just like forced it to change?
Right.
Would that mean that the barometer is causing the storm? Well, of course not. And this really highlights that flaw in those early kind of human-centered views of manipulation.
Yeah, that's a great example. It's kind of like saying that just because I can change the numbers on a thermometer, that means I'm magically changing the temperature.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So philosophers like Von Wright and Menzies and Price, they tried to build these whole theories of causation around this idea of human-driven manipulation. But they pretty quickly ran into some major obstacles.
Yeah, I bet. What kind of obstacles are we talking about here?
Well, one big one is the issue of things that just can't be manipulated, what we call unmanipulable causes, like earthquakes, for example. I mean, we know that they're caused by tectonic plates shifting, but no human can just like step in and control those massive forces, right?
Right.
So does that mean earthquakes have no cause? Of course not.
So how did philosophers deal with this problem? Because it seems like sticking to this idea of human-driven manipulation was creating more problems than it was solving.
Well, they realized they had to kind of refine the concept of manipulation itself, right? To move away from that human-centered view. And that led to the introduction of something called an intervention.
Okay, intervention. Now, this is starting to sound promising. But before we get too deep into that, can you help me understand what exactly makes an intervention different from just any regular old change?
Yeah, so think of an intervention as a very specific and targeted change to a very specific variable.
Yeah.
It's about isolating one particular causal pathway and then seeing what happens. And the key here is to try to eliminate or at least account for any other factors that could be messing with the results.
So it's not about saying humans have to manipulate this to prove causation. It's more like something has to change in this very specific way, regardless of whether a human is involved.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to see the distinction here, but I'm guessing there's more to it than just that, right?
Yeah, there are definitely a couple of different ways to think about what an intervention actually is. One approach, and this was developed by the computer scientist Judea Pearl, is known as setting interventions.
Okay, setting interventions. All right, I'm definitely intrigued now. Tell me more.
So basically, you can think of it as a thought experiment where we imagine setting a variable to a particular value And we do this regardless of whether or not it's actually possible to do that in real life. And then we use what we know about how the world works, maybe that's scientific laws or established models or whatever, to figure out what would happen if we could actually make that change.
So even if we can't actually manipulate something, like, say, the moon's gravity,
Yeah.
we could still use this setting intervention idea to explore the potential causal relationships.
Exactly.
Okay, that's fascinating. It's like we're running simulations in our minds, right? We're playing with the variables to see what happens. But I'm sure some of our more astute listeners out there might be thinking, hold on a second, isn't this whole intervention thing kind of circular? Aren't you basically assuming causation in order to define causation?
Yeah, that's a really sharp observation, and it's actually a pretty common critique of interventionist theories. But the important thing to remember is that we're not trying to reduce causation to something totally non-causal. It's more about using different kinds of causal knowledge, right, to help us figure out whether a specific relationship is truly causal. It's like we're using one piece of the causal puzzle to help us figure out the shape of another missing piece.
I see. So it's not a perfect circle. It's more like a spiral. With each loop, we're getting a deeper understanding of how causation works.
Exactly.
Now, I noticed that the Stanford Encyclopedia article also pointed out that not all causes are created equal. It talked about total causes, direct causes, contributing causes. I mean, it can feel like a lot to keep track of.
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure. And that's another reason why the interventionist framework is so useful, because it can help us untangle those different types of causal relationships.
Yeah.
So, for example, imagine we have this variable x, right?
Right.
And it influences another variable, we'll call it y. But it does this in two ways.
Okay.
It influences y directly, and it also influences y indirectly through another variable, z.
Okay, so we've got X. He's like a mischievous gremlin who loves pulling levers.
Yeah.
He can directly mess with Y, but he can also pull another lever that affects Z, and then Z goes on to mess with Y as well.
I love that analogy.
Huh.
So now we can use interventions to figure out whether X is what we call a total cause or just a direct cause of Y. So what we would do is we would intervene on X and see if we observe a change in Y.
Right.
But then we would intervene on Z and hold it constant.
Okay.
And we'd see if changing X still has an effect on Y. If it doesn't, then that tells us that X was only a total cause and it was acting through Z.
So interventions are like a magnifying glass, right? They help us zoom in and identify those direct causal connections.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like we're isolating the gremlin's hand on one specific lever.
Right.
And this ability to distinguish between different kinds of causation is really essential, especially when we're trying to understand complex systems where we have lots of different factors all interacting at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember the article also briefly mentioned something called token causation, which sounds like a whole other can of worms.
It is. It is. Token causation is all about understanding cause and effect at the level of specific events.
Okay.
So it's like saying that particular lightning strike caused that particular tree to fall.
Okay.
And we can actually apply interventionist approaches to those kinds of situations too. This can be especially helpful when we have those really tricky cases involving things like preemption or overdetermination.
Wait, preemption, overdetermination. Those sound like concepts ripped straight from a philosophy thriller.
Well, they kind of are. A classic example is the duel of the gunmen.
Okay.
So we've got these two gunmen, and they both fire at the same victim, right? And both of their shots would have been fatal on their own.
Okay.
So the question becomes, which gunman actually caused the death?
Yeah, that's a tough one. They both played a role, but how do we know which one was the deciding factor?
Right. So that's where interventions can help us out.
Yeah.
Because we can imagine intervening on each gunman's action.
Okay.
So we can ask, what if we prevented gunman 1 from firing? Would the victim still have died? And then we ask, what if we prevented gunman 2 from firing?
Right.
So by considering these hypothetical interventions, we can start to separate the actual cause from just a potential cause.
So it's like we're rewinding the scene, tweaking one element at a time and seeing if the ending changes.
Exactly. Now, even with all of these refinements to manipulability theories, there are still limits to how far this idea of manipulation can take us. And this is true even when we're just talking about manipulating things in our minds. Like, what about situations where we just can't manipulate the supposed cause, even in our imaginations?
Like someone's race or their species.
Yeah, exactly.
Could we even conceive of intervening to change those kinds of fundamental aspects?
Right. And that leads us to a really big question about the nature of causation itself, because for something to be considered a cause in this framework, it has to be representable as a variable that we can at least imagine changing.
So in the case of species, we'd need a way to picture, like, transforming a kitten into a lizard to see if that change affects anything else about its being.
Exactly. And that starts to get into territory that's both philosophically and scientifically really murky.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, if we can't even fathom a way to manipulate a supposed cause, then it might be a sign that we need to rethink whether it's a genuine causal factor in the first place.
Okay, so if we can't manipulate it, even conceptually, it might not actually be a cause at all.
Right. And some philosophers even argue that in these cases, we might need to reframe the whole causal claim in terms of factors that are manipulable. So instead of saying, ravenness causes blackness, we might shift our focus to the specific genes and developmental processes that influence pigmentation. Those are things that we can study and maybe even manipulate, at least in principle.
So it's like we're refining the question itself to focus on the aspects that we can actually wrap our minds around.
Exactly. And it's fascinating because the boundaries of what we consider manipulable are constantly expanding as our scientific understanding grows.
Right. What was impossible to manipulate yesterday might become possible tomorrow.
Exactly. And that's actually one of the things that I find so fascinating about this whole philosophical framework. It really encourages us to think critically about how we define and identify these causal links, and to remember that our tools and understanding are always evolving.
This deep dive is definitely making me appreciate just how complex causation really is. It's a lot more than just observing a change and then declaring, aha, I found the cause.
Exactly. It's about carefully thinking about how we define those causal links and recognizing that those definitions can change as we learn more about the world.
So even with all these refinements and extensions to manipulability theories, there are still some pretty big questions that remain unanswered. Like, is this ability to manipulate, even just conceptually, is that truly a fundamental requirement for something to be considered a cause?
And that's a question that continues to generate a lot of debate among philosophers, because interventionism, especially in its more strict forms, it really forces us to think about the limits of causal explanation itself.
It's interesting because the Stanford Encyclopedia article, it even hinted that some philosophers actually argue that causation might just be a kind of folk science concept,
Hmm.
a useful way to think about things in our everyday lives, but maybe not a fundamental truth of the universe.
Right. And the article even brought up the point that even in fundamental physics, it can be really hard to interpret things through a purely causal lens, like quantum mechanics. Events at that level, they can be probabilistic and non-deterministic. And it makes it really tricky to apply this interventionist framework when you're dealing with a system where you can't perfectly predict what will happen when you make a change.
So does that mean that causation is just an illusion? A convenient story we tell ourselves to try and make sense of a reality that's actually fundamentally a causal?
Well, not necessarily. It could be that our current understanding of causation, even with all these refinements, still needs some more tweaking. Or maybe it's just got a limited range of applicability. Maybe there are other ways of understanding causal relationships that we haven't even figured out yet.
It's like we've reached the edge of the map and we're peering into this uncharted territory.
Right.
Exciting and a little bit unsettling all at the same time.
I love that analogy. And that's what makes this whole exploration of causation so captivating.
Yeah.
It forces us to grapple with some really fundamental questions about the nature of reality and the limits of our own knowledge.
Well, my brain is definitely feeling a bit stretched after all of that. Interventionism is a powerful tool, but it's definitely not a simple answer to every question about causation.
For sure. It's a framework that encourages us to keep asking those questions and keep refining our understanding and to keep pushing the boundaries of what we know. And that's what makes the philosophy of science so dynamic and engaging.
Well, before we wrap up, you mentioned earlier that there were some kind of newer extensions to these interventionist theories, things like indeterministic interventions and soft
All
interventions.
right.
Would you mind giving us a quick overview of what those are all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So indeterministic interventions, those acknowledge that we can't always completely control a variable.
Right.
So instead of setting it to a specific value, we might only be able to influence the probability of it taking on certain values. So for example, think about public health campaigns that are designed to reduce smoking rates.
Right.
Those campaigns, they don't force anyone to quit smoking, but they can definitely affect how likely someone is to choose to smoke.
Yeah, that's a great example. It shows how this interventionist idea can be applied to situations that are a lot more nuanced and realistic.
Mm-hmm.
And what about soft interventions?
Right. So soft interventions, they're a bit different from those hard interventions we've been talking about.
Okay.
They don't completely break the existing causal connections that are influencing a variable. Instead, they introduce a new influence that's independent of all those pre-existing factors. A classic example is giving people extra income. That intervention, it changes their financial situation, but it doesn't erase or overpower all the other factors that were already affecting their
So
income.
it's like we're adding another layer to the causal web without disrupting the existing threads.
Right, exactly. And these developments, they really highlight how our quest to understand causation is an ongoing journey.
Yeah.
There are always going to be new puzzles to solve and new tools to develop as we keep digging deeper into this intricate web of cause and effect.
Well, on that note of intellectual curiosity and the ever-evolving nature of philosophical inquiry, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into manipulability theories of causation.
It's been a pleasure exploring this with you.
And to all our listeners, if this discussion has piqued your interest and you're ready to dive even deeper into this fascinating topic, be sure to check out our show notes. We'll have links to the Stanford Encyclopedia article and some other resources too. Until next time, keep those philosophical gears turning.
And I think that's a really good point you bring up about the whole, circularity issue, because it's not like we're saying, oh, you can only understand causation in terms of manipulation. It's more like it gives us a framework, right, for thinking about, okay, well, what kinds of things can we manipulate, even just in our minds?
Right.
And how can that manipulation help us clarify the causal relationships that we're trying to understand?
Hmm.
So I guess in a sense, it is kind of circular, but it's a productive kind of circularity,
Yeah.
It's not just going around and around, getting nowhere. It's actually helping us spiral in on a deeper understanding.
Yeah, I like that. It's like a spiral. Each loop around, we get a little closer to the center, to a better understanding of how things work.
Exactly. Exactly.
Now, the article, it also mentioned, and I thought this was really interesting, that not all causes are created equal. It talked about these distinctions between, like, total causes, direct causes, contributing causes, and it can be a little overwhelming, honestly, to try and keep them all straight.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There are definitely a lot of nuances when it comes to, the different ways that things can be causally related. But that's actually another reason why I think this interventionist framework is so helpful, because it gives us a way to kind of disentangle all those different types of causation.
Okay, I see what you mean. So how does it actually do that?
Well, let's think about an example. Imagine we have this variable x,
Okay.
and it has some influence on another variable y. But let's say it does this in two different ways. So first of all, it directly influences y, but then it also influences y indirectly through another variable, which we'll call z.
Okay, so I'm picturing, like, X is this little gremlin, right? He's pulling levers, and he can directly mess with Y, but he can also pull a lever that affects Z, and then Z goes on to affect Y as well.
That's a perfect analogy. I love that. So now, here's where interventions come in. We can actually use interventions to figure out whether X is what we call a total cause of Y, or if it's just a direct cause.
Okay.
So what we would do is we'd first intervene on X and see if we observe a change in Y.
Right.
And if we do see a change, then we intervene on Z and hold it constant.
Oh, okay.
And then we see if changing X still has an effect on Y. If it doesn't, then that tells us that X was only a total cause and it was acting through Z.
Okay, so it's like we're isolating the gremlin's hand on one specific lever, right, to see what happens when that one lever is pulled.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a great way to put it. And being able to make these kinds of distinctions between different types of causal relationships is really important, especially when you're dealing with these really complex systems where you've got lots of different variables that are all interacting in different ways.
Yeah, for sure. It's like untangling a really messy knot.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
got to figure out which strands are connected and which ones are just kind of tangled up by accident. Now, the article also briefly touched on this other really interesting concept. They called it token causation. It sounded like a whole other level of complexity.
It is. It is. Token causation gets into the nitty-gritty of like cause and effect at the level of individual events.
Okay.
So it's like saying that particular lightning strike caused that particular tree to fall. We're not talking about lightning in general causing trees to fall in general. We're talking about this one specific lightning strike in this one specific tree.
Right. Okay, I see what you mean.
And the cool thing is you can actually use interventionist approaches to think about these kinds of token causation scenarios too. And they can be especially helpful in those tricky cases where you've got things like preemption or overdetermination going on.
Wait a minute. Preemption. Overdetermination. Those sound like something out of a philosophy thriller.
Uh-huh, I know, right? There are these kind of mind-bending scenarios that really force you to think hard about what causation really means. So a classic example of this is the duel of the gunmen, you
Oh
know?
yeah, I've heard of this one.
So you've got these two gunmen, they both shoot at the same victim, right?
Right.
And both of their shots would have been fatal on their own. So the question is, which gunman actually caused the death?
Right. It's a tough one because it seems like they both played a role.
Yeah.
Right. But how do we pinpoint which one was the decisive factor?
Right. And that's where the idea of interventions can really help us out, because we can imagine intervening on each gunman's action, right? So we ask, what if we had somehow prevented gunman number one from firing? Would the victim still have died? And then we ask the same question about gunman number two. So by considering these hypothetical interventions, we can start to tease apart the actual cause from just a potential cause, the one that would have caused the outcome even if the other cause hadn't been there.
So it's like we're rewinding the scene and then tweaking one element at a time to see if the outcome changes.
Exactly, you got it. Now, even with all of these cool refinements to manipulability theories, there are still limits to how far this idea of manipulation can really take us. And that's true even when we're talking about, just conceptually manipulating things in our minds. Like, what about situations where we just can't manipulate the supposed cause, even in our imagination?
Yeah, like some things just seem fundamentally beyond our control, like, say, someone's race or what species they belong to. I mean, those seem pretty fixed.
Exactly. And that leads to some pretty deep questions about the nature of causation itself. Because in this framework, if we're going to say something is a cause, it has to be something that we can at least imagine changing.
Okay.
So in the case of species, like you said, we'd need some way to picture, I don't know, transforming a kitten into a lizard, right? To see if that transformation would lead to other changes.
Right, like a real-life Dr. Moreau situation.
Yeah, exactly. And that starts to get it into territory that is, well, it gets a bit philosophically and scientifically murky.
For sure. It's not an experiment I'd want to be in charge of.
No, definitely not. So I think, if we can't even fathom a way to manipulate something, even just conceptually, then it might be a sign that we need to rethink whether it's really a genuine causal factor at all.
So if we can't manipulate it, even in our minds, it might not be a cause at all.
It's a possibility, yeah. And some philosophers even argue that in these cases, we might need to try to reframe the whole causal claim in terms of things that are manipulable. So instead of saying, ravenness causes blackness, we might focus instead on the specific genes and developmental processes that actually produce that black pigmentation. Because those are things that we can, at least in theory, study and maybe even manipulate.
So we're basically shifting our focus to the things that we can get our hands on, so to speak, the things we can actually experiment with.
Exactly, exactly. And what's interesting is that, the boundaries of what we consider manipulable are constantly changing as our scientific knowledge grows.
Right. What seems impossible today might become possible tomorrow.
Exactly. And that's what I find so fascinating about this whole framework. It forces us to constantly be reassessing how we define and identify these causal links, and to remember that our tools and understanding are always evolving.
This is really making me appreciate just how complex this whole concept of causation really is. It's not just a matter of observing a change and declaring, aha, I found the cause.
Right, right. There's definitely a lot more to it than that.
It's about really carefully thinking about how we define those causal links and recognizing that those definitions can change as we learn more about the world.
Exactly, exactly.
So even with all of these refinements and extensions, it seems like there are still some pretty big questions that remain unanswered. Like, is this ability to manipulate something, even just conceptually, is that really a fundamental requirement for something to be considered a cause?
Yeah, that's a big one. And it's something that philosophers are still debating, because this whole idea of interventionism, especially when you get into those really strict versions of it, it really forces us to confront those limits of causal explanation. Like, how far can we really push this idea of manipulation before it starts to break down?
It's interesting because, the Stanford Encyclopedia article, it even hinted that some philosophers go so far as to say that causation might just be this kind of folk science concept, like it's a useful way for us to think about things in our everyday lives.
Right.
But maybe it's not actually this fundamental truth about how the universe works.
Yeah, there's definitely that possibility. And one of the things the article brought up was how even when you look at fundamental physics, sometimes it can be really hard to interpret what's going on in terms of cause and effect. Like, take quantum mechanics, for example.
Right.
Things at that level, they can be probabilistic, right?
Mhm.
They're non-deterministic, which means, you can't say for sure what's going to happen when you do something. And that makes it really tricky to apply this interventionist framework because it's all about, making a change and then seeing what happens. But what if you can't even predict what's going to happen when you make that change?
So does that mean that causation is just an illusion? Like, are we just making up stories to try and make sense of a world that doesn't actually work that way?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, it could be that our current understanding of causation, even with all the refinements we've been talking about, still needs some more work. Or maybe it's just got, a limited scope. Like maybe there are some areas where it applies really well and other areas where it doesn't work so well. And
Yeah.
maybe there are even other ways of understanding causal relationships that we haven't even thought of yet.
It's kind of like we've reached the edge of the map, right?
Right.
And we're peering out into this vast unknown territory. It's exciting, but it's also a little bit scary, you know,
Yeah.
because we don't really know what we're going to find out there.
I love that analogy, and that's what makes this whole exploration of causation so fascinating. It forces us to really confront these deep questions about, what is reality really like, and what are the limits of our ability to understand it.
Well, my brain is definitely feeling a little bit overloaded after all of that.
Yeah.
Interventionism is a really powerful tool, but, it's definitely not a simple solution to every question about causation.
For sure. It's more like a framework that encourages us to keep asking those questions and keep pushing those boundaries of what we think we know.
Well, before we wrap up, I remember you mentioned earlier that there are these kind of newer extensions to interventionist theories, things like indeterministic interventions and soft interventions. Do you have time to give us a little taste of what those are all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, with these indeterministic interventions, it's basically acknowledging that we can't always perfectly control a variable, right?
Mm.
So, instead of setting it to some specific value, all we might be able to do is influence the probability of it taking on certain values. Like, think about public health campaigns that are trying to get people to quit smoking, right?
Right.
Those campaigns, they don't force anyone to quit, but they can influence how likely someone is to make that choice.
Yeah, that's a good example. So it's less about dictating a specific outcome and more about kind of nudging things in a certain direction.
Exactly. It's about shifting those probabilities. And then you've got these soft interventions. And they're a little bit different because with these, we're not trying to completely break those existing causal connections that are already influencing a variable.
Oh, yeah.
Instead, we're introducing a new influence that's independent of all those pre-existing factors. A classic example of this is, giving people extra income. That intervention, it changes their financial situation, but it doesn't erase or overpower all those other things that were already influencing their income.
So it's like we're adding a new layer to the causal web
Yeah.
without totally disrupting the existing threads.
Exactly, exactly. And I think, these new developments really highlight how our pursuit of understanding causation, it's a journey, right? It's not a destination.
Right.
We're constantly discovering new things, developing new tools, encountering new puzzles.
Well, on that note of intellectual curiosity and the ever-evolving nature of philosophical inquiry, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive into manipulability theories of causation.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure exploring this with you.
It's been great. And to all of our listeners out there, if you're feeling inspired to delve deeper into this fascinating topic, make sure you check out our show notes. We'll have links to that Stanford Encyclopedia article we've been talking about, plus some other resources that you might find helpful. Until next time, keep those philosophical gears turning.